Oh, Bentley, brilliant, stubborn, visionary, walked away from the company he built, heartbroken and defeated. He would later go to work for Lagonda, another British carmaker, and continue engineering. But he would never again recapture the spark of his early days. The company that once roared across Europe, that once defied the odds at Le Mans, that once stood as a proud symbol of British defiance and speed, it no longer belonged to its maker. It belonged to the very people he once swore to beat. The tragedy of Bentley was not in failure. It was in success followed by betrayal. W.O. Bentley created something timeless, something magnificent. But the world was not kind to men who chose passion over profit, who chased speed instead of strategy, who built legends instead of ledgers. And as 1931 closed, the world moved on. The Bentley boys vanished into history. The trophies were boxed up, the factories grew quiet. And the name Bentley, though still alive, no longer burned with the same fire. It was no longer the roar of a rebel. It was the whisper of a ghost. Chapter 4, Ghost of a Brand, the silent years of Bentley 1931 to 1980s. After the storm came the silence, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that chokes memory, buries pride, and leaves nothing but shadows where legends once stood. From 1931 onward, Bentley was no longer Bentley, not in soul, not in spirit, and certainly not in identity. The body remained, but the heartbeat was gone. When Rolls-Royce took over Bentley in 1931, they didn't just acquire a company. They seized its name, its prestige, its racing legacy, and then slowly smothered its soul under a velvet glove. Publicly, they claimed they were preserving British motoring excellence. But the truth was colder. Rolls-Royce had bought Bentley to bury the competition. They bought brilliance to control it. They bought rebellion to tame it. And the world, distracted by war and economic despair, barely noticed the quiet extinction of one of the most passionate brands in history. W.O. Bentley was forced out with dignified silence. No grand farewell, no statue, just a quiet departure. The man whose initials formed the brand's identity was now a stranger to his own creation. He watched from afar as his beloved company became little more than a marketing tool, used to slap a different badge on reworked Rolls-Royce models. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Bentley cars kept being produced, technically, but they were no longer Bentleys in spirit. The raw, aggressive, road-dominating machines of the Le Mans era were gone. In their place came polished, posh sedans, indistinguishable from their Rolls-Royce siblings except for a badge and a grille. The bold roar of rebellion had been replaced with a whisper of conformity. Customers weren't buying Bentleys anymore because they loved Bentley. They were buying because it was a slightly cheaper, slightly less flamboyant Rolls-Royce. The badge had survived, but the fire behind it had been extinguished. And as the years passed, the Bentley brand became more of a ghost, floating silently through showrooms, respected but no longer feared, existing but no longer exciting. World War II gave both Rolls-Royce and Bentley an excuse to shift their attention. Aircraft engines became the new priority, and the automobile business drifted quietly into the background. Bentley's identity faded even further into the mist. Gone were the races. Gone were the Bentley boys. Gone was the soul that once defied all odds to beat Europe's finest. By the 1950s, the tragedy deepened. Rolls-Royce was now designing Bentleys as badge-engineered clones. The Bentley R-Type, the Bentley S1, the Bentley 2 Series, all of them were just Rolls-Royces in disguise. The press noticed. Enthusiasts noticed. But no one did anything. It was like watching a once great athlete slowly forget how to walk. You didn't want to say it out loud, but you could feel it. The Bentley you knew was gone. And W.O. Bentley. He died in 1971 quietly, unceremoniously. Without the company he gave his life to, without the world remembering what he had built, what he had sacrificed, and what had been taken from him. That was perhaps the most tragic part of all, not the fall, but the forgetting. The generations that followed didn't even know the name W.O. Bentley. They saw the badge and assumed it was always just a cousin to Rolls-Royce. They didn't know about Le Mans. They didn't know about the engineering genius. They didn't know about the man who refused to compromise, who built engines like symphonies and treated speed like religion. They didn't know that Bentley was once a warrior, not a butler. By the 1970s and 1980s, Bentley had reached its lowest point. The cars were slow sellers. The name was old-fashioned. Even among luxury buyers, Bentley was no longer considered desirable. It was seen as the conservative alternative to Rolls-Royce, dull, outdated, lacking identity. A once proud banner had become a second-choice brand. Dealerships carried Bentleys out of obligation, not pride. Marketing materials barely differentiated them from their Rolls-Royce siblings. And while Rolls-Royce clung to its royal associations and jet-set image, Bentley drifted in the background, like a forgotten actor once famous, but now typecast as that other guy. And that's how the decades passed, not with fireworks or failures, but with neglect, a slow decay, a dimming light. Bentley had become a ghost of its former self, still walking, still talking, but hollow on the inside. And nobody wept, because nobody remembered. The world had moved on. The tragic irony is this: Bentley didn't die because it failed. It died because it was successful enough to be worth stealing, and brilliant enough to be feared. And for that, it was suffocated, not by enemies, but by those who claimed to be saviors. It was never meant to be this way. Bentley was supposed to be a roar in the dark, not a whisper behind the curtain. It was built to win, to push, to break records, not to quietly chauffeur executives to black-tie events. But that's what it became, a trophy mounted on a shelf by a competitor, left to collect dust. And so, for over half a century, Bentley didn't live, it merely existed. A nameplate without a purpose, a legend in chains. But even ghosts can remember what they once were. Even ghosts can haunt the halls of history, waiting for someone, anyone, to bring the fire back. Chapter 5. The Brand Without a Heart, 1930s-1970s. They say a body can live for a while after the heart stops beating, it breathes, it moves, but it's not truly alive. That was Bentley from the 1930s through the 1970s, a brand that still built cars, still carried its proud name, but had no soul left to fuel its purpose. It was a luxury shell, beautifully dressed but hollow, haunted by the memory of what it used to be. In 1931, when Rolls-Royce acquired Bentley, the transition was packaged as a noble rescue, the mighty Rolls-Royce stepping in to save its struggling counterpart. But that's not what happened. It wasn't a rescue, it was a silencing. It was a quiet execution dressed in silk. The truth is, Rolls-Royce didn't want to help Bentley. They wanted to eliminate a threat. Bentley had built a name by being fearless, rebellious, performance-driven, everything Rolls-Royce was not. It wasn't about luxury. It was about domination, about spirit, about engines that screamed past the finish line. And for Rolls-Royce, that was dangerous. So, they bought the name. They took the factory, they took the brand. But they killed the soul. From that moment on, Bentley was no longer allowed to think for itself. Its identity was absorbed, its uniqueness was dissolved. It became a mere division, a subsidiary, a shadow under the vast umbrella of a more conservative, more refined competitor. It was like putting a lion in a tuxedo and forcing it to sip tea, a complete contradiction to its nature. W.O. Bentley, the visionary who once engineered machines that devoured roads and crushed rivals at Le Mans, was quietly pushed aside. His opinions no longer mattered, his passion was no longer needed. He was made irrelevant in his own house, a father watching his child raised by strangers. And the public didn't see the heartbreak. They didn't hear the doors closing behind him. History doesn't always record quiet tragedies. But that moment, the silencing of W.O. Bentley, was the beginning of a 40-year death. By the mid-1930s, Bentley's cars were already showing signs of soulless duplication. They looked like Rolls-Royces, felt like Rolls-Royces, and were designed with the same DNA. Yes, they were slightly cheaper. Yes, the grilles were a bit different. But beneath the hood, they were nearly identical. The racing pedigree, gone. The bold experimentation, gone. The edge that once made Bentley stand out, completely erased. Bentley became a badge, nothing more. The rest of the 1930s was consumed by global instability. And then came World War II. Rolls-Royce turned its focus to aircraft engines, and car production slowed. The war consumed all attention, and in the ashes of battle, few remembered what Bentley had once stood for. Its legacy, once hot with passion and victory, became just another footnote in a post-war economy struggling to rebuild. The 1940s and 1950s brought a new kind of Bentley, the limp Bentley. The S-Series, the R-Type, and later the T-Series, all elegant, well-crafted, and technically competent. But they weren't Bentleys in the spirit W.O. intended. They didn't roar, they didn't defy, they complied. By now, Bentley was openly just a badge-engineered version of Rolls-Royce. Dealerships didn't even pretend they were different. Salesmen offered customers a choice. Do you want the Rolls with the spirit of ecstasy, or the Bentley with the winged bee? That was it. No story, no uniqueness, just branding. Even the interiors, the engines, the frames, identical. Owning a Bentley didn't mean something anymore. It was just a different logo on the same product. The average customer wasn't a racing enthusiast or a lover of mechanical excellence. He was a businessman looking for understated luxury. Bentley had been tamed, and nobody even noticed it bleeding. What made this chapter so tragic wasn't just the sameness, it was the absence of protest. There was no outrage, no rebellion. The racing fans were silent. The engineers complied. W.O. Bentley had faded into obscurity. It was as if everyone had quietly agreed to pretend that Bentley was never more than a cousin to Rolls-Royce. Even the press, once obsessed with Bentley's racing prowess, no longer cared. Reviews praised the comfort, the quietness, the refinement. But where was the thrill? Where was the danger? Where was the soul? Bentley had become polished to death. The 1960s brought more of the same. Sales plateaued. The T-Series, released in 1965, was elegant but uninspired. Customers who bought Bentleys in this era were doing so out of nostalgia or brand habit, not passion. The younger generation, those coming of age during the Cultural Revolution, didn't even know what Bentley was supposed to stand for. They saw it as an old man's car, outdated, boring, a relic from a different time. And they were right. The 1970s were perhaps the most sorrowful of all. Bentley's share of Rolls-Royce production fell below 10%. That's right, for every 10 luxury cars produced, maybe one was a Bentley. It had become an afterthought, a ghost brand floating through the showroom with no story to tell, no fire to reignite, and no audience that remembered its greatness. By this point, Bentley was no longer dying, it was dead, and no one had noticed. This wasn't just a business failure, this was an emotional tragedy. A brand that once stood for engineering courage, relentless ambition, and thunderous victory was now reduced to nothing but a name, a luxury label sewn onto someone else's suit. And the saddest part, W.O. Bentley, the man who had sacrificed everything to bring his vision to life, never got it back. He never saw his name resurrected with glory. He died in 1971, with Bentley still lifeless, still muzzled, still stripped of its identity. The brand he built to roar had spent decades in a whisper, and he died before he could ever hear it scream again. For over 4 decades, Bentley was a body without a heart, a name without a soul, a legacy buried under someone else's brand. But even the dead can rise again. Even a forgotten name can find its voice. And even a brand without a heart can one day remember how to beat again. Chapter 6, The Fall of Rolls-Royce and the Splitting of Legends 1980-1998. By the dawn of the 1980s, the silence around Bentley had become deafening. It had been half a century since the brand had tasted true individuality. Half a century since its engines had been allowed to scream. Half a century since W.O. Bentley's dream had been muzzled and put in the back seat of a car that no longer bore his spirit. And yet, quietly, something began to stir beneath the surface. Not because Bentley remembered who it was, but because Rolls-Royce began to forget who it was, and in its unraveling, the chains around Bentley began to loosen. The early 1980s were dark times for Rolls-Royce. After years of mismanagement, outdated strategies, and a lack of innovation, the company was in financial trouble. The aura of eternal prestige it once held was beginning to fade. Their customers were aging, their designs were becoming stagnant, and the market, especially in America, was changing fast. Wealth was shifting, younger, flashier millionaires were emerging, and the stoic elegance of Rolls-Royce no longer captivated their attention. It was during this quiet crisis that Bentley, once gagged and bound, started to move again. Not because anyone had a grand plan for its revival, but because desperation led to experimentation. In 1982, Bentley launched the Mulsanne Turbo, and for the first time in decades, a Bentley had something unique under the hood. It was powerful. It was aggressive. It didn't just glide down the road, it attacked it. This car was different. It was like someone had taken the covers off the coffin and let Bentley breathe again. The turbocharged V8 engine was not just a technical upgrade. It was a message, a whisper in the industry. Bentley might still be alive. Customers noticed. More importantly, Americans noticed. And for the first time in years, Buyers didn't want the Rolls. They wanted the Bentley. It had performance, it had presence, it had fire again. Slowly, the brand began clawing its way back, not because it had support, but because it had nothing left to lose. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Bentley started building its own identity again. The Bentley Turbo R, launched in 1985, was a defining moment. It was fast, it was bold, and it was finally, not just a Rolls-Royce with a different grille. It had been tuned for handling, the suspension was stiffer, the power was real, the car felt like it had a mind of its own. And it wasn't just for show, automotive journalists raved about it. Bentley's sales, which once made up barely 5% of Rolls-Royce motor cars' total production, surged. By the early 1990s, that number had grown to over 40%. A quiet revolution was taking place, a rebellion inside the factory. Bentley was no longer content to be the silent sibling. It was growing bolder, more distinct, and more confident. And while Rolls-Royce was still stuck in its old, grand, conservative ways, Bentley was attracting a new type of beer. The young, the wealthy, the bold. The ones who didn't just want to be driven, they wanted to drive. But this resurgence came at a strange and tragic time, because behind the scenes, the very company that had shackled Bentley for so long was starting to crumble. The core of the issue wasn't even in the cars, it was in jet engines. You see, Rolls-Royce as a brand had always been split into two main entities. One made cars, and the other made aircraft engines. The engine side, Rolls-Royce plc, had become one of the biggest suppliers of military and commercial jet engines in the world. It was vital to the UK's defence industry. The car company, on the other hand, Rolls-Royce Motors, was a small player in comparison. And when Rolls-Royce plc got into trouble in the early 1970s and went bankrupt, the government stepped in and nationalised it. But the car division wasn't part of the bailout. It was left behind, sold off, first to Vickers plc in 1980. Vickers was a conglomerate. They didn't care about cars. They cared about money. And by the 1990s, they wanted out. The car business wasn't bringing in the returns they wanted, even with Bentley's rise. So they made a decision that would reshape automotive history. They decided to sell Rolls-Royce Motors. Suddenly, two of the world's most iconic brands, Rolls-Royce and Bentley, were up for grabs. Here's where the tragedy deepens, and the story takes a surreal twist. Two giants came to the negotiation table, BMW and Volkswagen. BMW already had a working relationship with Rolls-Royce Motors. They supplied engines and electronics for both Bentley and Rolls-Royce cars. They were seen as the logical peer. But Volkswagen came in with a massive, unexpected offer. They outbid BMW and bought the entire company in 1998 for £430 million. Or so they thought. In a bizarre twist of fate, BMW had done their homework. They didn't just want the factory or the designs. They wanted the name. And they discovered something incredible. Vickers didn't own the Rolls-Royce name. The trademark for Rolls-Royce still belonged to the aerospace company, Rolls-Royce plc, and Rolls-Royce plc wasn't part of the deal. So when VW bought the car company, they got the factory, the designs, and Bentley, but not the name Rolls-Royce. BMW went directly to Rolls-Royce plc and paid just £40 million to license the name, the logo, and the iconic Spirit of Ecstasy emblem. The result? Volkswagen had everything ... except the one thing they really needed. The right to build a car and call it a Rolls-Royce. It was a corporate nightmare. A war erupted behind the scenes, lawyers swarmed, executives panicked. It was like two men fighting over the same crown, one holding the castle, the other holding the title. In the end, a truce was formed. Volkswagen would continue building Rolls-Royce and Bentley cars at the Crewe factory until the end of 2002. After that, the brand would split. Bentley would stay with Volkswagen, and Rolls-Royce, the name, the legacy, and all rights to future models would go to BMW. Just like that, the legends were divided. For the first time in almost 70 years, Bentley would finally be free. Free from the Rolls-Royce shadow, free to build its own future, its own identity, and its own destiny, under a new parent that actually wanted to see it thrive. But this freedom came at the cost of a heartbreaking end. The death of Rolls-Royce Motors as the world had known it. And that was the fall. Not with a bang, but with a contract. Not with fire, but with ink. A quiet, strange, legal tragedy that split the soul of British automotive history right down the middle. Bentley had been reborn in fire and chaos, but what lay ahead would be even more unexpected. A rise from the ashes so powerful, so defining, that it would change the very future of the brand. Chapter 7. Legacy in Shadows. Bentley still exists today, but it lives in a luxury echo chamber. Wealthy collectors, celebrities, and corporations purchase them more as status symbols than mechanical marvels. The racing spirit is no longer at the center. The British heart has been replaced by German engineering. W.O. Bentley died in 1971, long before his company's brief resurrection. He never saw the revival. Perhaps that's for the best. What remains is a ghost of a dream that was too fast, too proud, and too fragile for the world it was born into. Epilogue. What we can learn. The story of Bentley is more than just cars, it's a lesson. It tells us that talent is not enough, that passion must be protected, that in the race between vision and capitalism, vision often gets crushed under the wheels of greed. W.O. Bentley built machines with soul, and the world traded them for machines with profit. Today, his name is etched into grills and stitched into seats, but the man, the dreamer, the rebel engineer, he's been nearly erased. So the next time you see a Bentley gliding down a smooth road, remember, it was born from war, built for glory, stolen by rivals, and silenced by time. This isn't just a brand, it's a ghost story on wheels.